5. Roy Bean and the Chinaman. It is time now to talk about Roy Bean's affair with the Chinaman. The earliest and shortest version of the story appeared in the El Paso Daily Times for June 2nd, 1884. Here is the latest on Roy Bean. Somebody killed a Chinaman and was brought up standing before the irrepressible Roy, who looked through 2 or 3 dilapidated law books from stem to stern, and finally turned the culprit loose, remarking that he'd be damned if he could find any law against killing a Chinaman. That is the core of what has become, after 50 years, one of the best-known anecdotes ever to come out of the Southwest. Time must have been about the beginning of 1883. The ends of the tracks were joined in January. In the West, hundreds of Chinese laborers were building. From the East came the Irish and other brawny sons of Europe. The white laborers hated the Chinese for their willingness to work for low wages, their saving ways, and their squeakish gibberish, and for their love of peace. More killings than one occurred when the gangs from the East and West got close enough to rub elbows and cut throats, and there were many narrow escapes. For example, take the night of 1882 when the Irish, who had almost built the east side of Pecos, got involved in a celebration and decided that their lives would be wasted unless they crossed over to where the Chinese were camped in the West Bank and cut off a few pigtails. They knew that if a Chinaman did not like to fight, and would not fight under ordinary provocation, but it would give satisfactory performance if his pigtail were cut off. So these drunk and joyful Irishmen organized themselves and were all ready to start out when the foreman interfered and averted the race riot by a very slim margin. Even so, the Chinamen lost their lives by one means or another and were buried where they fell. Later, the bones of many of them were collected and sent back to the West Coast by Chinese friends who came in for that purpose. Usually the Americans concerned themselves very little about whether the Chinaman lived or died, but somehow the historic case under discussion was brought to Roy Bean for judgment, and he turned the Irishman loose, as most Americans in West Texas would have been glad of an excuse to do. On account of the feeling between the Chinese and their other laborers, it would have been easy to start a race riot just then, and Roy knew it. Besides, as he once said, there were about 200 of the toughest white men in the world around the saloon, and they might have lynched him if they hadn't let the Irishman go free. His decision was merely his own peculiar way of preserving law and order, and at the same time protecting the health of Judge Bean. But the ruling had a real gamey western tang and stuck in men's minds. The story not merely lived, it grew. By 1899, he was getting into the newspaper exchanges in this way. At Langtry, Texas, says the San Francisco Wave, Squire Roy Bean, who administers justice and keeps the leading saloon, had to sit in judgment on a railroad clerk who had killed Ah Ling, a laundryman, for, as he claimed, insulting him. The man was arrested and brought before the magistrate Bean, who listened to the evidence, which was given by the accused himself, and then proceeded to turn the pages of the revised statutes. This here book, which is a Texas law book, he announced, says that homicide is a killing a human, male or female. There's many kinds of homicide: murder, manslaughter, plain homicide, negligent homicide, justifiable homicide, and praiseworthy homicide. There's 3 kinds of humans: white men, niggers, and Mexicans. It stands to reason that if a Chinaman was human, killing him would come under the head of praiseworthy homicide. The prisoner is discharged on condition that he pays for having the Chinese buried. In print and out of print, the story went around, gathering details and variations. In the last 10 years, it has been reprinted a dozen times, and every fresh book about the old days of the Southwest tells its new way. In 1934, F. H. Bushick put it his own version in his book, Glamorous Days. Some cavalry soldier in passing through that way, it was thought, had lost his saber. One of the bridge gang found it. When it was brought into camp, nobody wanted the old corn cutter except the Irishman, who took a shine to it because he had once been a soldier himself. He ground up the old blade and kept it in a handy weapon. He, being a storekeeper of iron supplies, a responsible sort of job. The Irishman was in the habit of now and then stealing a pie from the cook. The Chink got the missing pies, finally laying the Irishman and caught him red-handed. Armed with a big butcher knife, the Chink attacked the Irishman, who ran and got his old saber and returned to the fray. He made one pass at the Chink with his saber and cut off his head as clean as if the Lord High Executioner of China had done the job. The ranger arrested the Irishman and took him before Judge Bean. The most remarkable variation of all occurred in 1931 in Tom Reining's book Gun Notches. Tom was an old cavalryman and peace officer who knew Roy, and this is the way he tells it. Once Roy's son shot and killed a Chinaman because he charged too much for his laundry or something serious like that. And of course, young Bean was tried before his old man. Naturally, Roy wanted to give his boy as easy a deal as the law would allow, but he was a square shooter, and if his son turned out guilty of a misdemeanor or anything like that, there was a cinch he'd wrap it up to him like he was just a stranger. So the judge opened court with the usual formalities, throwing out a couple of drinks who wouldn't quit snorting during the proceedings, and started the justice mill grinding. On account of his own kin being up for trial, and all the customers watching him were more interested than usual, he went about things mighty careful and legal-like. As a rule, he gave his decisions right out of the deep knowledge of the law, for he'd been at JP for a year or more. But this time he had figured he had to dig into the unabridged statutes of 1846, or somewheres around that date. He hooked his spectacles onto his handsome big red nose and began reading the law book out loud so everybody could see he wasn't keeping any ace in the hole. And damned if he didn't read those Texas statutes from cover to cover, cussing every cowpuncher awake that went to sleep on him, and refusing to let any of them go to the bar for a drink during that long spell of court. When he'd waded plumb through the Texas law from murder to cow brands in about 2 hours or so, those cowpunchers and rustlers had got a darn sight more legal knowledge screwed into their skulls than lots of the tin-horn lawyers of the state ever knew. In fact, there was a plumb nuisance after that, some of them spouting the information about Texas law by the hour every time they got drunked up and could get some unfortunate dogey to stand hitched long enough to pour it into him by the gallon. "And there she is, gentlemen," says Roy Bean, when he'd got through. "That's the full unexpurged law of the great state of Texas up to 1873, and it ain't no ways likely to been any fundamental charges run into since. The complete statutes of here state and the Alamo on the head, and there ain't a damn line in it nowheres where it makes it illegal to kill a Chinaman. The defendant's discharged." You can ask anybody over 40 in West Texas, and any man under 40 if he knows anything about Roy Bean, and you will get another edition of the same tale. It is already part of American folklore. The man who shot the Chinaman and started all storytelling may still be alive. Uncle Bill Jones, who has kept the bar at a reserve, New Mexico, since 1886, says he is, and Uncle Bill was at Langtree when the trial happened. Now, Bill doesn't think he should talk too much about the man, however. "I'm not permitted to tell his name," he says. "Last time I heard of him, he was tending bar. He is a pleasant sort of person, very agreeable." Well, people do change.